Long tee shots into the backyards and into the trees don't really do us much good. So in this video, we're going to look at a really important element to hit straighter tee shots. When we look at the closing, the squaring of the club face in the golf swing, especially with the driver, it's a really complex, really detailed account of a lot of things, both from the golfer and the equipment that goes on. So we're going to kind of take this piece by piece in this series, and we're going to look today at when the club starts to square, when that club face starts to square, and what the golfer is doing when the golfer is kind of forcing that club face to square. So we're going to look at two key parameters here. We're going to look at grip roll, and that's really the rotational, that screwdriver move that you are putting onto the grip of the club to twist it close. And it's a rotational number in degrees per second. And then we're going to look at closure rate. That's the club face closing relative to the club path. And we're going to look at those two numbers with two highly accurate pros here. And they're going to help us kind of figure out when this stuff starts to happen. So if we scroll this guy back up to the top, our first pro, we're going to see that almost right away, very early in the downswing, when this grip roll number hits positive, we're right here at 1 degree per second, so it's just turning positive, this golfer is twisting the grip. The grip is twisting close. So that screwdriver effect the golfer is applying to the grip starts to take place way up here in the downswing. That's how early this golfer is preparing to square the face or starting to square the face. And we can see how, as we scroll him forward, how the grip roll and the closure rate really don't go on a 1-to-1 ratio. You don't get at the club face necessarily what you're applying to the grip. There's torque in the shaft, the club head is resisting the twist, all of those things are happening. So it's a really unique occurrence with all of us, depending on our equipment, the shafts that we play, our release style, our wrist angles, all of those things play a part of this. So it's not a uniform occurrence here in this closing or squaring of the club face. But what is pretty uniform is when it starts to happen. Now let's go and take a look at, we'll just scroll this golfer here through to impact, and just you can see the numbers. So we're just over 1,000 degrees per second of him twisting that grip, him rolling that grip, and right at over 250, just barely over 250 of grip closure. So we're at about a quarter of his effort. His grip roll went into the actual closing of the club face. And it's something that you're going to see fairly often, is that it's not a 1-to-1 ratio. Those things are not the same. Now let's go to our second pro. An unbelievably straight driver of the golf ball, but does it differently, controls his club face differently than the first pro we looked at. So we're going to see a much more of a cupped left wrist at the top of the downswing. And that's going to play into this scenario a little differently than we looked at the bowed wrist of the first golfer. So we're going to see that he's later. He gets to his positive grip roll number here, kind of that left arm parallel. And so we saw the first golfer way up there towards the top of his swing. This golfer is much, we'll say a lower left arm, that left arm parallel, but it's still very early in the downswing. And then we can see as we scroll him through there, as his wrist starts to flatten and straighten and arch, that his grip roll really starts to speed up and really starts to accelerate much later in the golf swing. Right at impact now, he's 700 plus more degrees per second than our first golfer, but only 100 plus more closure rate degrees per second. So you could argue that maybe he's working harder to close it because he got a little bit later start. You know, this golfer probably not aware of the difference, but equally straight drivers of the golf ball, they just arrive differently with regards to their ratios and their amounts of grip roll and closure rate. But one thing that we can see with virtually every good player we've looked at, and I'll say with every good player we've looked at, if we go back to our first golfer here, we can see that bowed wrist and how he really starts to to crank down earlier. And then if we go down to our more of a cupped wrist golfer, it starts a little later, but it still happens in this kind of early window. We'll call it our pro zone of when these guys start to really crank on the grip of the club to start closing that face. Now, what we see in contrast is kind of through this zone here, which we'll call it our no zone, is where we see, the most common shot in golf is the open face slice. And that's because we see so many amateur golfers, especially as we start getting up in the higher handicap ranges, that they don't do enough work. They don't do enough of that screwdriver move, that reverse motorcycle move early in the downswing. And they leave themselves way too much work to do too late. Club head is moving too fast. The equipment's kind of resisting all of that. There's just not enough time to get that club face square, so they're left with an open face. They start coming over the top to try to get the ball started in a playable range. But we can see it in these numbers that this no zone range here, we'll call it, it happens too late. You need to start. Golfers need to start. We all need to start squaring the club face, twisting that club face much higher, much earlier in the downswing. And this isn't one of those things where the body's going to do it for us. This isn't a freebie. We have to actually apply torques to the golf club to make it square. It's not going to do it on its own. So if you want to hit straighter, more accurate shots, which also is going to mean more longer shots, you need to start preparing this club face much earlier in the downswing so we can hit the ball straighter and longer down the fairway.